Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also in South Africa for the BRICS summit, and he's due to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin for bilateral talks. Erdogan is attending the summit in his capacity as chairperson of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Russia and Turkey have been stepping up their cooperation in the Syrian conflict, so it's believed the two leaders will be discussing the crisis there. Russia has also sold air defense systems to Turkey. NATO opposes the deal, though. Turkey's president has also been keen to boost ties with the African continent. Erdogan has visited 20 African countries in recent years. Well, let's get you more now on that meeting between Presidents Putin and Erdogan. I'm joined live from Moscow by our correspondent Jessica King. Also joining us live is Michelle Bar-David in Istanbul. Jessica, let's start with you. What's the significance of Putin's meeting with Erdogan in South Africa, especially given the recent Putin-Trump summit?
Yes, well, the Kremlin here in Moscow is saying that the two leaders will be discussing Syria, and that certainly does indicate perhaps even more cooperation between Putin and Erdogan on the current crisis. And so many people will be watching that meeting closely to see what comes out of it and if it does show that their relationship seems to be getting a little closer. Of course, Russia and Turkey have backed different sides in this Syrian conflict, but ultimately they are strategic partners in this, given that they are both part of the Astana process, which is their joint process along with Iran. And we're hearing that there will be more talks between these three countries on resolving the situation in Syria at the end of this month in Astana in Kazakhstan. So along with that, they will also be talking about trade and development. As you mentioned there, Ankara is negotiating the purchase of these S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, and this has raised many eyebrows among NATO. Of course, Turkey's part of NATO, and definitely among Washington as well. In fact, recently we've heard the United States saying, warning countries around the world, including warning Turkey, that if they do make any significant transactions with Russia on Russia's military hardware, then they could be facing sanctions. So many people will be interesting to see what comes out of that. I think for President Putin, meeting Erdogan and also meeting the other leaders of the BRICS countries is very important, and not only symbolically, because it is a symbol to the West, a signal, I should say, to the West, particularly after that Trump-Putin summit, that Russia isn't isolated. They do have allies and they can get along fine without them, symbolically, but also economically, as there could be deals on the table with Turkey over these defense missiles. And we're also hearing reports that around $1 billion could be on the table from the BRICS New Development Bank for some large infrastructure projects in Russia as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Jessica. We'll return to you in a moment. Michelle, now over to you. Turkey, as we've been talking just now, is involved in the conflict in Syria. How closely is Ankara working with Russia when it comes to the Syrian conflict?
Yes, they are certainly working very closely. As Jessica already mentioned, the Astana peace process has brought them very close as two of the three guarantor states with Iran. They have been able to establish de-escalation zones in Syria. They have been cooperating regarding humanitarian efforts there. And this has been very critical because Turkey also needs a lot of support, as Turkey has been carrying out a lot of the burden regarding the Syrian conflict when it comes to Syrian refugees who have entered Turkey. There are 3 million Syrians in Turkey at the moment. So Turkey doesn't need a lot of support when it comes to the Syrian conflict with Russia especially. But it's also important to emphasize that Turkey has been carrying out cross-border operations in Syria. For example, the Afrin operation. And in that term, Turkey also needs a lot of support, a lot of cooperation, a lot of coordination with Russia when it comes to cross-border operations, just to avoid confrontation between Russian and Turkish soldiers in that area. But also one important critical factor when it comes to cross-border operations is the use of airspace in Syria, and Turkey also needs the clearance of Russia when it comes to that. So it's been critical to see how closely they have been able to cooperate despite being on the opposite sides of the conflict.
Okay, Michelle, thank you for that in Turkey. We'll return to you in a moment. Jessica, back to you in Moscow. The Syrian conflict has essentially reached the border with Israel now. What's the latest on Moscow's efforts in that conflict?
Well, the intensifying Israeli-Syrian conflict has prompted intervention from Moscow, and the foreign minister here, Sergei Lavrov, has been on a mission over the last 3 days, meeting other world leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to try and stabilize the situation, which appears to have escalated over the last few days. We've also been hearing reports about plans from Moscow to help Syrian refugees return home, and actually there is going to be a meeting here in Moscow this afternoon with the defense minister on this Moscow initiative to set up a center for the reception, allocation and accommodation of refugees. So the plan is to work with the partners to try and help the hundreds of thousands of refugees who have gone abroad to try and return to Syria. But of course, this all requires very careful diplomacy from Russia, as they've sort of positioned themselves as this peace broker or this middleman in the Middle East. It's difficult to balance all of these strategic partners that, of course, they want to keep on side. And many saying that actually Putin doesn't have as much control over these various players in Syria as he would like to think.
Okay, thank you for that. That was Jessica in Moscow. And finally, over to you again, Michelle, in Turkey. As we know, Turkey is a member of NATO. Do you think that's likely to come into play during talks between Erdogan and Putin?
Well, it's surely going to be a key factor there when we're talking about Turkey and Russia getting closer and closer as they're improving their ties. This is, of course, very significant for NATO. As Jessica mentioned, one of the main issues for them is the purchase of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia by Turkey. And this, of course, is a very significant and sensitive issue when it comes to security. Turkey has been criticized by the United States, but also by NATO. But Turkey, in return, has also been criticizing the U.S. for not providing them with the Patriots missile defense system, and Turkey says that it definitely needs these kind of support from NATO as well. So there are very delicate balances there when it comes to Turkey and its security concerns. Of course, Turkey wants to clear its border areas from the Kurdish militants, and that in itself, the YPG group, is already an issue of conflict because the United States has been supporting this group. However, Turkey believes it's a terrorist organization. So there are a lot of different issues that are creating conflict in there. But when we're talking about Turkey and Russia relations, they are getting closer and closer, and they also have very significant large projects in the making. We have the Turk Stream gas pipeline project that they have been cooperating on, but also the Akku nuclear power plant, which is a major energy project for Turkey as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That was Michelle Bar-David in Istanbul, and earlier, of course, we spoke to Jessica King in Moscow.